handsome, charming, well-educated man. He had a degree in psychology. He was pursuing a law degree, and he had kind of a funny way of picking up the women. He would carry a stack of books and put on a fake cast on his arm or leg, really rack up the sympathy points. And after class, I'd kind of hobble home across campus. And if he saw a pretty girl that he liked, he'd stumble and drop the books, and she'd come over. "Oh, let me help you. Let me grab those for you. I'll walk you to your car." "Oh, okay, thanks. They get to the car. And if she wouldn't want to come home with him, he would force her inside. This man would go on to kill a countless number of women in the most brutal fashion. Ted Bundy was eventually convicted of killing 36 women, and 30 of which he helped law enforcement crack the case that he could remember or describe. And some suspect that it was many more than what he was convicted of. How does somebody become so monstrous? Well, Ted had a change of heart, it seems, right at the end of his life. He claims he found God and become a born-again Christian, and that he was intensely remorseful. And in his final hours, he had dedicated himself to spark a conversation that he hoped would help people avoid becoming the kind of thing that he had become. And he attributed much of his sinister side to his addiction to hardcore pornography. He wanted to make it clear that he'd grown up in a perfectly normal home, a good Christian home by all accounts, went to church, parents didn't fight, he wasn't abused, he wasn't touched. He wanted to make that distinction because he didn't want people to think his family or his past or his childhood did this to him. He attributed this directly to his lust, and I think what he described as putting flesh around his lust. So in his final hours, the night before he was to be executed, he had invited, with a media circus, everybody wanted to hear what he had to say, to interview him. He had invited one man to give his final interview, and that was Dr. James Dobson, who created Focus on the Family. He was a clinical psychologist who cared deeply about traditional family, and so in that conversation, Dr. Dobson had a chance to walk through his journey a little bit, and there's a little piece of this transcript that I found interesting. I'll share it with you. Dr. Dobson said, speaking about pornography, it fueled your fantasies. And Ted said, in the beginning, it fuels this kind of thought process, and then at a certain time, it's instrumental in crystallizing it, making it into something that is almost a separate entity inside. Dr. Dobson replied, "You'd gone about as far as you could go in your own fantasy life with printed materials, photos, videos, etc. And then there was this urge to take that step over to a physical event." Ted said, "Once you become addicted to it," and I look at this as a kind of addiction, "you look for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material. Like an addiction, you keep craving something which is harder and gives you a greater sense of excitement. And so you reach the point where the pornography only goes so far. That jumping off point where you begin to think, maybe actually doing it will give you that which is just beyond reading about it and looking at it." So it's describing this evolution of lust to the point where it becomes its own person, its own entity inside of you with its own desires. He would describe after satiating the thirst for rape and blood, his energy would sink back down, and he felt like he was coming out of a trance. He would feel himself again and feel great remorse. So this thing would literally have its own life inside of him, and it was this by continually feeding this addictive cycle by continually worshiping at the altar of pornography and alcohol. For him, it stimulated the growth of this life in him that he felt like was not his own, but he was a slave to. So this is something I think we can look at and see that throughout human history, we have always done this. But we do it to different degrees. And I think for a lot of us, we say to ourselves or justify, well, because I'm not Ted Bundy, like what I'm doing isn't really hurting anybody. But he's evidence that we escalate our lusts. We escalate our idolatry. The places that we go to seek gratification, to seek comfort, to seek happiness, if those places aren't at the kind of altar that can offer us life, then they will always end in death of some kind. And we can also look at the Old Testament. We have a really interesting look at this same concept in that we can see it in Deuteronomy and Kings. Asherah poles. See, God, Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament and of the New, hates the worship of other gods because he knows that there's no life there. He knows that a community of people that worship other gods will eventually completely, like a cancerous tumor, spread throughout society, and at some point the death and gangrene is too much for a society to bear, and it collapses. And so this jealous God would go to war against other gods. And really, I think that's what a lot of the Old Testament shows us, is that God desires deeply for relationship with us because he is the source of life and the only source of life. And so demands our relationship with him, the worship at the true altar. So we have King Solomon, David's son. He allowed, in a way of sort of trying to please, he had a lot of wives, and a lot of these were just arrangements from other kingdoms. He didn't even meet most of the wives that he had. These were arrangements that would allow the unification of kingdoms, which this was something that God had requested he not do, because we eventually, if we're trying to keep this society from the worship of other gods or idols or these traditions, these national heritages that don't fit the model that God demands of us of holiness and righteousness, that it'll eventually seep in. And Solomon ignored that, and so he would make these arrangements with other kingdoms, and he'd be married to somebody, and that was really more of a business arrangement. And he would allow these wives to keep their traditions. That they worshipped at the Asherah poles. They worshipped Moloch, where child sacrifices were made on the altar. And God hated that. God warned Solomon twice sternly, don't do that. That's not, if you do, you'll be losing. The 12 tribes of Israel will be lost. So the Asherah poles, what are those? These are like phallic symbols that would sit high on a hill, and people would go worship there. But what was the worship? It was like a kind of fertility god. It was sex. They would go have sex under the Asherah pole, and that was church on Sunday. So if you've got a people who are being told, like, well, we've got the God of the Ten Commandments, and a God of the tithe, and God of prayer and worship, where we show up to church and we pray together on Sundays, or we can go have sex under the Asherah pole. A lot of people are going to choose to go have sex under the Asherah pole. And what does God say about that? He hated it. He said, I, God myself, will turn against such a man, cut him off from the body of his people, for in giving his offspring to Moloch, he's defiled my sanctuary and profaned the holy name. I will uproot from among you the Asherah poles when I demolish your cities. You must tear down their altars, shatter their sacred pillars, burn up their sacred Asherah poles, and cut down the images of their gods. You must eliminate the very memory from that place. God has a hard time competing with our worship at the Asherah poles because we're such a temporary, fixated on the temporary kind of people. And he knows that once we get absorbed into that way of thinking, it becomes an addiction that's hard to defeat, and we do evolve into something much more monstrous than we ever thought we were capable of. As much as we want to justify that we can handle our addictions, we can handle our however we decide to worship at any altar other than the altar of God, that's a lie, and eventually it leads to chaos and death. I know in my own life, I'm absolutely guilty of this. I've been worshiping at my own versions of Asherah poles for years and years, and it brought me to the brink of insanity, where I literally had to start questioning my sanity. It's only upon returning to the one true holy God where clarity begins to enter in, and we can start to see how insidious that entity that is growing in us has become. I want us to think about and reflect on our Asherah poles. Where have we gone to worship? What are we trading by going to worship at our Asherah poles when we could be reflecting, meditating, worshiping, being in relationship with the God that can heal and save? It was on the Mount of Olives that Solomon set up the first of these Asherah poles. Solomon had an interesting introduction into that. It was Adonijah, King David's son, who had tried to usurp and take the throne from him. And it was a prophet that came to David and said, it needs to be Solomon. This wasn't a good king. He wouldn't be a good king. And Solomon was basically the bastard son of his. He had essentially raped Bathsheba, an object of his fixation, David, and killed Uriah the Hittite, her husband. It was out of sin that Solomon was born, but Solomon was to be the heir of the throne. So there was a great procession. It was a big to-do when David decided it was going to be Solomon that he gave the mantle of the kingdom to. And when Solomon came in to the city as king, it was with great fanfare. All the soldiers with swords held high, and everybody had come out to greet him. It's this exact same image that Jesus, before his crucifixion, rode into the same town, the same city, on a donkey, and his followers had palm fronds held high. It was a mirror image of the act before. Jesus was declaring himself king, and those palm fronds were swords. And it was on the Mount of Olives that Jesus, before being crucified, was taken. After his death and resurrection, he ascended. And two angels standing next to the disciples that watched him literally fly away said, the way that you see him go is the way that you're going to see him return. Christ conquered that hill on the Mount of Olives, the place where the Asherah poles were set up. We have the opportunity to worship a God that brings life, to help us break down the addictive cycles, the things that create these entities, monstrous entities inside of us. And he wants to do that for us. But we have to be in relationship with that one, the one who can conquer the Mount of Olives and the Asherah poles and tear them down. We will all bow the knee one way or another. Some willingly with joy and gladness, with an inheritance before us, and some with fear and trembling. Let's reflect on our Asherah poles. Let's tear them down. Consider worshiping the one true God who can bring life and life to the fullest. He was a hand